Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing great. Today we will discuss briefly about the topic which is known as shock. We will study briefly about this topic as per the exam point of view. We will not go deep into this topic. Just as per the exam point of view, we will discuss main important points about this topic. So, starting with the definition of shock. What do you mean by shock? What is the definition of shock? In simple words, the shock is defined as its decreased O2 availability, its decreased oxygen availability to the organ, to the organ, or decreased oxygen availability to the tissue as well. When there is reduction of oxygen to the organ or tissue, there is decrease of ATP production. The ATP, what this ATP is used for the maintaining the balance, maintaining the function of the tissue or the organ. But when the oxygen is reduced, the ATP is also decreased, and by this, when the ATP is decreased, there is the dysfunction of that particular tissue or organ. I hope you understand the common definition of the shock. So let us describe about oxygen delivery. How the oxygen is delivered to the tissue. As we all know that oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin, and hemoglobin hemoglobin is as a part of the blood. So the oxygen is also carried with the blood. And the blood, how is the blood flow maintained? Blood flow to all the organs in our body, to all the tissues in our body, is maintained by cardiac output. Blood flow is maintained by cardiac output. This cardiac output is responsible for helping the blood to reach all the parts of the our body, while the blood it delivers oxygen to each and every component of our body. So cardiac output is basically dependent on two things, two components, which is heart rate as well as stroke volume. So what do you mean by stroke volume? There is a simple formula for that. The stroke volume is defined by preload. We have all studied about this in CVS. Preload multiplied by myocardial contractility. The preload which is present as well as the myocardial contractility, and whole divided by the afterload present. As we all know, this preload, what is this preload? It is the end diastolic volume. So let us move on to the classification of shock. Classification. How is the shock classified into different types? First of all, the shock, we all know, it is basically divided into four types. The first one, let us see. The first one is hypovolemic shock. The second one is cardiogenic shock. The third one is distributive shock. We'll study about them. And the fourth one is obstructive shock. These are all types of shock. We will discuss them one by one. briefly. So starting with the first type, which is first classification of shock, is we will study with the hypovolemic shock. What do you mean by hypovolemic shock? So regarding hypovolemic shock, as the name suggests, it means when there is an hypo means less. So when there is an decreased volume, and volume of what? There will be decreased blood volume, and by this the shock caused is known as hypovolemic shock. So what does the decreased blood volume do? When there is decreased blood volume, what happens? When there is decreased blood volume, there is a decreased filling of ventricles. There is a decreased filling of ventricles. What happens? Actually, when the blood volume is less, uh, the filling of ventricles is less because there is no much volume present to fill the ventricles as per the normal rate. But due to the low blood volume present, there is a decreased filling of ventricles. When there is decreased filling of ventricles, there is not much amount of volume for the heart to pump, so that creates decreased cardiac output. This creates decreased cardiac output, which eventually, when there is a decreased cardiac output, which eventually decrease the systolic blood pressure as well. It decreases the systolic blood pressure as well. And when the cardiac output usually is less, what happens? We told about that the blood flow, that the blood, that the oxygen reaches to the all parts of all components of the body by the cardiac output maintained by our body. But when there is an increased cardiac output, the blood doesn't the all our organs or tissues doesn't get sufficient amount of blood, doesn't get sufficient amount of oxygen, so that when there is a decrease in the cardiac output, there is decreased oxygen delivery to that particular tissue or organ. And when there is decreased oxygen delivery to the tissue or organ, there is a lack of ATP production. There is a lack of ATP production, but there is an increased lactic acid accumulation or production due to the presence of anaerobic breakdown. It will increase the serum lactate in our body. And when there is, and how we defined hypovolemic shock, it was all due to the decreased blood volume. Now we can move on to this, the etiology of those things which cause the blood volume to decrease. So what are the main causes which can cause the loss of blood volume in our body? The main cause can be, the first cause, it can be hemorrhages. It can be hemorrhages. Hemorrhage can be of different causes. It may be from trauma or GI loss. It can be through different types, etc. Even it can be through blood volume can also be lost through GIT problems also, like diarrhea. It can also cause decrease in the blood volume, or even due to polyuria, increased urine production. So these are some of the basic these are some of the points, these are some of the causes which can cause decreased blood volume. Now after that, if we move on to our second one, which is cardiogenic shock. After moving from hypovolemic shock, we move on to cardiogenic shock. What cardiogenic shock is? Cardiogenic shock is defined when there is a problem with the contractility, with the heart pump, with the pumping of our heart. When there is a problem, when there is a deficient contractility, when there is an internal malfunctioning of our heart, of the pumping system of our heart, That time the shock which is caused is known as cardiogenic shock. Let us describe briefly what cardiogenic shock is. Actually, this cardiogenic shock is usually caused by decreased myocardial, as I said, contractility. And here again, when there is a decreased myocardial contractility, when the heart is not pumping sufficiently, what happens? It definitely decrease our cardiac output because it is not pumping enough to to maintain the cardiac output. It is not pumping enough to maintain the cardiac output. Again, when there is an decrease in the cardiac output, what happens? There is a decrease in the cardiac index. There is decrease in the mean arterial pressure. There is decrease in the systolic blood pressure, etc. Again, due to the decreased cardiac output, again the same mechanism, the oxygen delivery is deficient to all the tissues, to all the tissues and the organs, by which there is a lack of production of ATP. There is a death of the tissues as well, uh, so that there is an increased production of lactic acid which can go on to the shock. There is a deficient oxygen for our tissues and organs. And what was the main cause for cardiogenic shock? It was decreased myocardial contractility. And now, what are the etiology of cardiogenic shock? The etiology will be particularly focused on those causes which can cause this to happen. The causes which can cause this to happen. What is this? This is the decreased myocardial contractility. So the causes will be those which can cause myocardial contractility to reduce. And what are those causes? There can be myocardial infarction. You all know what is it. Myocardial infarction can cause decrease in myocardial infarction. There can be myocarditis. There can be even increased pressure overload, or even there can be increased volume overload, so that there is decrease in myocardial contractility. So this was about the cardiogenic shock. Our third type of shock is distributive shock. The third type is distributive shock. So studying with the third type of shock, which is distributive shock, the distributive shock is also known as vasodilatory shock. Now by the name you can guess what is the mechanism of this type of shock. It is also known as vasodilatory shock. In this type of shock, it is also, as usual, our body can't get enough blood to our main vital organs in our body, like heart, brain, or kidneys. This happens. What happens in this type of there happens because blood vessels, the blood vessels are excessively, they are excessively dilated. The blood vessels are excessively dilated in this type of shock. When there is an excessively dilation of the blood vessels, when there is excessively dilation of the blood vessels, what happens? It can lower our blood pressure. It can decrease tissue perfusion. It can cause decreased central venous pressure. It can cause stagnation. All this mechanisms eventually reduce the oxygen supply to our tissues and organs. Even there are some another mechanism. Often small blood vessels are leaky in distributive shock, so that it results in some fluid loss from the circulation as well. Now there are further different types of distributive shock. We will not discuss them. One is septic shock. Another one is anaphylactic shock, and another is neurogenic shock. So what is it? The septic shock, as the name suggested, it is usually from a bacterial infection, a serious infection, severe bacterial infection, which can cause sepsis that gets so bad it leads to septic shock. Anaphylactic shock, it is usually from an allergic sources, allergic reaction, severe allergic reaction that can cause this anaphylactic shock to happen. And another one, neurogenic shock, it is usually from the damage to the nervous system. Now moving on to the last type of shock, which is obstructive. And if we define by its name, obstructive means when there is when it happens when there is an mechanical or even physical obstruction to the flow of blood. It can be this mechanical obstruction. This obstruction can be in major vessels, arteries, or even in heart itself. The obstruction can be present in major vessels or arteries, major arteries, or even heart itself. And the main causes, the main etiologies which can cause this obstruction, which can cause this problem are, if we like, for example, there can be tension pneumothorax, there can be cardiac tamponade, there can be pericardial effusion, there can be mediastinal tumors, there can be even pulmonary embolus. This as we said, these tumors of mediastinal tumors, these can increase intrathoracic pressure. Cardiac tamponade is present, even pericardial effusion, they can all reduce the preload. These are some of the causes. Even pulmonary embolus cause severe obstruction in the flow of blood. So this was the brief discussion about the types of shock, what is shock classification. Regarding the management or treatment of the patient with shock, you all can study that part in the medicine or pathophysiology or pharmacology. But the mainstay of treatment, it is usually to maintain the ABC, airway, breathing and circulation, appropriate fluid oxygen supply, treatment of underlying cause, etc. Thank you very much. I hope this video will be useful for